The fluorescent lights hummed in the low-ceilinged briefing room deep beneath Moscow's Ministry of Defense complex. It was February 1972, and the winter cold seeped through concrete walls that had stood since Stalin's time. Colonel Engineer Yuri Volkov tapped his cigarette against a steel ashtray, watching ash fall like snow as he studied the grainy photographs spread across the mahogany table. "This," he laughed, a short, dismissive bark that echoed off the walls. "This is what the Americans believe will rule our skies?" The images showed an aircraft with twin vertical stabilizers, an angular fuselage, and oversized air intakes that looked almost comical. McDonnell Douglas's new F-15 Eagle, still months from its first flight, already looked outdated to Soviet eyes trained on the elegant curves of the MiG-25 Foxbat, the fastest interceptor in the world. Major Dmitry Petrov leaned forward, tracing a finger along the F-15's wing profile. "American propaganda," he muttered. "Look at this design. Those intakes, much too large, draggy, inefficient, and twin engines? Wasteful." He shook his head, gray eyes narrowing with professional contempt. "They learned nothing from Vietnam. Still building muscle where they need brain." Outside, Moscow slept under February darkness, unaware that in St. Louis, Missouri, American engineers were welding together something that would haunt Soviet doctrine for the next 50 years. The Americans had studied Vietnam's lessons differently. They'd watched their F-4 Phantoms, heavy, sluggish bombers forced into dogfights, get carved up by lighter MiGs. They'd counted the dead pilots and made a promise: never again. Colonel Viktor Belyakov, head of TSAGI's Aerodynamic Assessment Division, stood at the room's far end, arms crossed over his chest decorated with medals from a career spent calculating thrust-to-weight ratios and turn rates. He was older, quieter, and unlike his younger colleagues, he wasn't laughing. "Gentlemen," he said softly, but the room fell silent. "Consider the numbers." He walked to the chalkboard, chalk squeaking as he wrote. Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines. Combined thrust, over 58,000 pounds. Empty weight, approximately 28,000 pounds. That gives them, he paused, doing the mathematics that would later prove prophetic, a thrust-to-weight ratio exceeding 1-to-1 at combat weight. Volkov waved his hand dismissively. "Impossible. The engines would tear themselves apart. American metallurgy cannot handle such stresses." "Can't they?" Belyakov turned, his weathered face unreadable. "Remember, we once said the same about their moon rocket engines." The room shifted uncomfortably. The N-1 launch failures were still fresh wounds. For massive explosions, Soviet moon dreams scattered across the Kazakh steppe while Americans planted flags in lunar soil. That had been arrogance too. Comfortable certainty that Soviet engineering had no equal. But Belyakov's concerns were drowned by consensus. The reports continued flowing back to Moscow through the 1970s, each one reinforcing Soviet confidence. The F-15 was expensive, nearly $18 million per aircraft, astronomical even by American standards. It was complex, those fancy electronics everyone knew would fail in combat conditions, where sand and vibration and electronic warfare turned sophisticated systems into expensive paperweights. "They're building a peacetime fighter," Volkov concluded in his final assessment to the Central Committee. "Beautiful in theory, useless in war." At Ramstein Air Base in West Germany, on a gray morning in January 1977, Captain Robert K. Cobra McKinley climbed the ladder into the cockpit of his F-15A, the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing's newest arrival. The canopy, a single piece of polycarbonate stretching from nose to tail, gave him visibility that felt like sitting in a glass cathedral. Every switch, every dial, every warning light was exactly where his hands expected them to be. The heads-up display projected critical information directly onto the windscreen. He could track targets, manage weapons, monitor systems, all without looking down into the cockpit's green glow. Behind him, across the Iron Curtain, Soviet pilots were climbing into MiG-23 floggers, swing-wing interceptors that looked futuristic but fought like trucks with wings. Their radar sets were powerful but crude, their missiles fast but easily spoofed, their cockpits cramped and dark. McKinley didn't know this yet. He didn't know that within a decade, F-15s would face Soviet-built aircraft in skies over Lebanon, Iraq, and beyond. He didn't know about the 104 aerial victories that would come. He only knew that when he pushed those throttles forward and felt 58,000 pounds of thrust slam him back into his seat, when he pulled the F-15 into a vertical climb and watched the German countryside shrink beneath him, he was flying something the world had never seen before. Something that could accelerate straight up. Something that could turn inside anything in the sky. Something that, in the right hands, was nearly invincible. In Moscow, in offices deep underground where maps showed NATO bases and Soviet countermeasures, the laughter was already beginning to fade. The first confrontation reports were filtering in from East Germany, Western F-15s intercepting Soviet reconnaissance flights with a speed and agility that made even the MiG-25 look clumsy. Ground control operators were reporting that the American fighters were disappearing from radar even without jamming, their profiles somehow smaller, harder to track than physics should allow. Belyakov read these reports alone in his office, long after his colleagues had gone home. He'd spent 40 years calculating what aircraft could do, should do, would do. And these numbers weren't lying. The Americans hadn't built a peacetime fighter. They'd built a Predator. And it was already hunting. The sun rose over the Bekaa Valley on June 9, 1982, painting Lebanese mountains in shades of copper and gold that would soon be stained with smoke. Israeli Defense Force intelligence had been tracking Syrian buildup for weeks. SA-6 missile batteries positioned in terraced positions, their radar dishes sweeping the sky like mechanical eyes. Soviet advisors crawled through the installations, confident in technology that had bloodied American F-4s over Vietnam and shot down Israeli aircraft in previous wars. What they didn't see were the 4 F-15s orbiting in Israeli airspace, 30,000 feet up, pilots' eyes fixed on radar screens that showed the entire battlefield with a clarity Soviet engineers had insisted was impossible. Captain Moshe, Machete, Melnik's thumb rested on the stick, feeling the F-15 respond to his thoughts more than his movements. Below him, the valley was alive with Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s scrambling from their bases, climbing to intercept Israeli strike packages. His APG-63 radar painted them all, 16 contacts, their altitude, speed, and heading updating every second. The pulse Doppler system filtered out ground clutter that would have blinded older radars, showing him a god's-eye view of the approaching fight. Eagle Flight, this is Control, the controller's voice crackled through his helmet. You are weapons-free. Good hunting. Melnik didn't reply. He was already selecting the first target, a MiG-23 climbing hard, its pilot thinking altitude would give him advantage. The F-15's computer calculated intercept geometry faster than any human mind could process. The AIM-7 Sparrow missile hanging under his wing knew where the MiG would be 3 seconds from now, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. At Kubinka Air Base outside Moscow, Colonel Volkov, older now, his hair gray where it had been black, sat in a secured communications room reading field reports from Syria. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From rage. 12 aircraft, he read aloud to his aide. 12 Syrian fighters lost in the first engagement. 4 MiG-21s. 8 MiG-23s. He looked up, his face pale beneath the harsh overhead lights. Against 4 Israeli F-15s. There must be errors in the report. There are no errors. Volkov slammed his fist on the desk. The pattern has repeated across 6 days. Our aircraft, Soviet aircraft, flown by Syrian pilots we trained, are being slaughtered. Not defeated. Slaughtered. The numbers were worse than any nightmare. By the end of the Lebanese campaign, Israeli F-15s would claim over 40 aerial victories. The kill ratio was so lopsided it seemed impossible. Syrian pilots reported the same thing again and again. The American fighters appeared on their radar far later than they should. When Syrian pilots fired, F-15s turned inside the missiles, defeated them with maneuvers that should have torn wings off. And when F-15s fired back, their missiles tracked through evasive maneuvers, through chaff clouds, through desperate dives toward the ground, and killed. Belyakov had tried to warn them. But even he hadn't understood how completely the Americans had rewritten aerial combat. Edwards Air Force Base, California. 3 years earlier. Test pilot Major Jim Shooter Sullivan had pushed an F-15 through a test that should have been routine, a high G-turn at 30,000 feet, measuring structural limits. He'd pulled back on the stick, loading the aircraft to 6 gs, feeling the familiar pressure crushing his chest, graying his vision at the edges. Then the left wing broke. Not cracked. Not stressed. Broke. Metal fatigue from a manufacturing defect sheared off 3 feet of wing during a vertical rolling maneuver. The F-15 lurched violently to the left, completely unbalanced, aerodynamically impossible to control. Edwards Tower, Eagle 3-2, I've lost my left wing. Sullivan's voice was tight but controlled. Training suppressed panic. Attempting to recover. I'm going to try to bring her back. In the tower, controllers stared at radar screens showing an aircraft that shouldn't be flying. Soviet engineers, reading this report months later, shook their heads in disbelief. An aircraft cannot fly with one wing. This was fundamental. Physics didn't negotiate. But Sullivan had 58,000 pounds of thrust. He had fly-by-wire controls that could make 1,000 adjustments per second. He had an airframe built with margins of safety that bordered on paranoia. He leveled the wings, or what remained of them, and nursed the crippled fighter back to base, landing at twice normal speed, the F-15 touching down in a shower of sparks and burning rubber. The aircraft was fixable. The Soviet confidence was not. In simulation rooms across the USSR, fighter pilots were now training against F-15 profiles. The scenarios never ended well. MiG-29 pilots, flying the Soviet Union's newest fighter, their answer to the Eagle, found themselves consistently outranged, outmaneuvered, outthought. The American aircraft shouldn't have been better. Soviet radar technology was proven. Soviet missiles had range and speed. Soviet training emphasized aggression and numerical advantage. But the F-15 didn't fight the way Soviet doctrine expected. It killed from beyond visual range, firing missiles before Soviet pilots even knew they were being hunted. When forced into close combat, it turned impossibly tight, its powerful engines letting it convert speed to altitude, altitude to angle, angle to kill position. It could shoot while looking up, shoot while looking down, shoot at targets its pilot couldn't even see, the radar and computer doing the geometry, the missile doing the killing. We built interceptors, Belyakov said quietly during a classified briefing to the Politburo in 1983. Old men in dark suits listened with expressions carved from stone. The Americans built hunters. He pulled up a slide showing combat reports from Lebanon, from encounters over the Baltic, from NATO exercises where F-15s routinely defeated Soviet aircraft in mock combat by ratios that would have been called propaganda if they weren't verified by neutral observers. Every advantage we believed we had, speed, numbers, missile range, they neutralized or exceeded. The MiG-25 is faster, but the F-15 can operate at high speeds longer without burning through its fuel. Our missiles have range, but their electronics are more resistant to countermeasures. We have numbers, but... He paused, choosing words carefully. One F-15 can manage 8 targets simultaneously. We would need to overwhelm them with ratios we cannot sustain. A general in the back row stood. Then we build something better. With what? Belyakov's voice was tired. The Americans designed this aircraft in 1969. We are in 1983. We are 14 years behind a design specification. How many years behind their current development? Their next generation? The room had no answer. In Nevada's desert, at Nellis Air Force Base, American pilots were already training against Soviet tactics using captured or simulated MiGs. Red flag exercises pit F-15 pilots against the best aggressor pilots flying Soviet profiles. The kill ratios remained stupidly lopsided. In one exercise, a single F-15 downed 6 Soviet aircraft before running out of missiles. The humiliation wasn't just technological. It was psychological. Soviet fighter aviation had built its identity on the Great Patriotic War, on Pokrishkin and Kozadub, aces who dueled Luftwaffe experts over Stalingrad and Kursk. That pride had carried through Korea, where MiG-15s shocked the world. Through Vietnam, where MiG-21s proved themselves deadly in the right hands. But the F-15 wasn't fighting individual duels. It was systematic, clinical. Pilots described it as hunting deer, not fighting peers. You found them. You locked them. You killed them. They rarely knew you were there until the missile was seconds from impact. Captain Alexander Zuyev, one of the Soviet Union's most decorated test pilots, defected to Turkey in 1989 flying a MiG-29. His debriefing with American intelligence included brutal honesty. We knew we couldn't beat them. In exercises, we hoped for luck. In real combat, he shook his head. We would die professionally. The storm Belyakov had seen gathering was breaking. And it was breaking over everyone who'd laughed. The night sky over Iraq was black as oil when Captain Rick Kluso Tolaini pushed his F-15C through the darkness at 25,000 feet. It was January 17, 1991, the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm, and the largest air campaign since World War II was about to prove, once and forever, what the F-15 could do. Below him, in the desert darkness, Iraqi radar operators stared at screens showing what looked like the entire American Air Force coming at them. They weren't wrong. Over 700 aircraft were launching the opening strike. F-117 Nighthawks hitting command bunkers, F-4G Wild Weasels hunting SAM sites, waves of strike fighters headed for airfields and military installations. Defending Baghdad were pilots flying Soviet-built fighters, MiG-29 Fulcrums, MiG-25 Foxbats, MiG-23 Floggers, the same aircraft that Soviet engineers had once promised could match or exceed anything the West could build. Saddam Hussein had spent billions building the world's sixth-largest air force. Soviet advisors had trained Iraqi pilots for years. The integrated air defense network around Baghdad was modeled on Moscow's own, layered, redundant, theoretically impenetrable. Tolini's radar warning receiver chirped softly. An Iraqi fighter had just gone active, its radar sweeping the sky. His APG-70 radar, an upgraded version of the system that had dominated Lebanon, was already tracking the contact. Range, 48 miles. Altitude, 15,000 feet. Climbing. Type, MiG-29 Fulcrum, Iraq's best fighter. Pennzoil flight, Eagle 01 has a contact, bearing 270, 48 miles, hostile criteria met, Tolaini called calmly over encrypted radio. His wingman acknowledged with 2 clicks. The MiG-29 pilot never saw him coming. Iraqi radar was already chaos, jamming from EA-6B Prowlers, deception from F-4G Wild Weasels, overwhelming numbers confusing ground controllers who were screaming contradictory vectors to their pilots. The MiG pilot was trying to sort out which radar contact to target when Tolini's AIM-7M Sparrow missile left the rail at supersonic speed, its seeker head locked on the Iraqi fighter's radar return. The MiG exploded in a fireball visible from 30 miles away, the first aerial kill of Desert Storm, claimed by an F-15C at a range where the Iraqi pilot had no chance of fighting back. It was a pattern that would repeat for 43 days. In Moscow, in the same underground rooms where they'd once laughed at F-15 specifications, Soviet military observers watched satellite feeds and intelligence reports with expressions of professional horror. This wasn't war. This was an execution. Colonel Volkov, now a general, older, wearier, but still sharp, stood before a wall of screens showing real-time updates from Iraq. Each red symbol that blinked out represented a Soviet-built aircraft. In 72 hours, the Iraqi Air Force had lost over 35 fighters in aerial combat. Every single kill belonged to F-15s. Every single one. "The Americans are not taking losses," his aide reported, voice hollow. "Not one F-15 has been shot down. Not one." Belyakov, now in his 70s but still consulting for the military, sat in the back of the room. He'd stopped making predictions. The numbers spoke for themselves. Captain Steve Tate got his kill on January 19th, a MiG-25 Foxbat trying to flee toward Iran. The Foxbat was the fastest fighter the Soviets had ever built, capable of Mach 3.2, designed to outrun anything. Tate fired an AIM-7 from 30 miles away, watched the missile track flawlessly, and saw the massive Iraqi interceptor, the pride of Soviet engineering, come apart in midair like a toy hit with a hammer. "Splash one Foxbat," Tate called, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter taking down legendary prey. The Foxbat had terrified Western intelligence for years. MiG-25s had outrun Israeli F-4 Phantoms over the Sinai. American pilots had spent decades training to counter the Foxbat threat. And now they were swatting them from the sky like flies. Captain Larry "Cherry" Pitts got his on January 26th, two MiG-23 floggers trying to intercept an American strike package. His radar found them at 55 miles, beyond the range where they could detect him. He fired two AIM-7s within seconds. Both Iraqi fighters exploded, their pilots never knowing what killed them. The entire engagement lasted 90 seconds from detection to double kill. The psychological effect on Iraqi pilots was devastating. They stopped flying. Some flew their aircraft to Iran and defected rather than face American F-15s. When coalition aircraft entered Iraqi airspace, Iraqi fighters stayed on the ground, pilots refusing orders to scramble. Those who did take off often jettisoned their weapons and ran for Iranian airspace the moment their radar warning receivers screamed that an F-15 had locked them up. Soviet observers couldn't blame them. In classified briefings, Soviet fighter pilots viewed gun camera footage from Desert Storm with the silence of men watching their own funerals. MiG-29s, their latest most advanced fighter, getting splashed from ranges where they couldn't fire back. Iraqi pilots executing textbook Soviet defensive maneuvers, doing everything right according to doctrine, and dying anyway because American missiles tracked through maneuvers that should have defeated them. "There is no counter," one Soviet instructor pilot wrote in his assessment. "The Americans have created a system where our aircraft cannot close to weapons range before being destroyed. If they survive the long-range missiles, they face a fighter that outturns and outclimbs anything we have fielded. The engagement is decided before it begins." Captain J.O.P. Denny scored the last aerial kill of Desert Storm on February 7th, a MiG-21 trying to escape to Iran. The MiG pilot was flying low and fast, using terrain masking, executing perfect evasive maneuvers. Denny's AIM-7 found him anyway, the pulse Doppler radar tracking the MiG through ground clutter that should have hidden it. The missile detonated so close to the ground that the explosion threw up a fountain of desert sand. When the ceasefire came on February 28, 1991, the accounting was complete. Iraqi Air Force losses in aerial combat, 38 aircraft confirmed destroyed. F-15 losses in aerial combat, 0. It wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. Every combat aircraft in Soviet inventory, MiG-21, MiG-23, MiG-25, MiG-29, even the feared Mirage F-1, had been systematically hunted and destroyed by F-15s. The air superiority fighter the Soviets had laughed at in 1972 had achieved a combat record unprecedented in the jet age. General Volkov submitted his final report to the Ministry of Defense in March 1991. It was brief: "We have no tactical or technological answer to the F-15. Our current inventory is obsolete. We must consider that American air superiority doctrine is now 20 years ahead of our own capabilities. 3 months later, in August 1991, the Soviet Union began its final collapse. The Cold War was over. And everyone knew who had owned the skies. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum as retired Major General Yevgeny Belyakov stood before the F-15A hanging in the permanent collection. It was 2015. He was 93 years old, his uniform replaced by a simple gray suit, the medals from a lifetime of Soviet service hidden in a drawer back in his Moscow apartment. Behind him, a tour group of children listened to their guide explain the aircraft's specifications. First flown in 1972, the guide said. Undefeated in aerial combat. 104 kills. 0 losses to enemy aircraft. The most successful fighter in aviation history. Belyakov closed his eyes, remembering that briefing room in 1972, the laughter, the certainty. How young they'd all been. How certain. The F-15 had gone on to serve with the Israeli Air Force, the Saudi Royal Air Force, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. Each operator added to its combat record. Israeli Eagles claimed over 50 Syrian aircraft. Saudi Eagles shot down Iraqi fighters during Desert Storm. In every conflict, in every engagement, the pattern remained unbroken. You saw it first. You shot first. You won. Colonel Rick Tolini, now a retired 2-star general, stood at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, watching a flight of F-15EX Eagles taxi for takeoff. It was 2023. 51 years since the first F-15 flew. The fighters taxiing past him carried weapons, sensors, and electronics that would have seemed like science fiction in 1991. But the basic airframe was the same. Those same twin tails. Those same powerful engines. That same predatory stance. Why keep building them? A young reporter asked him. Isn't the F-15 obsolete? We have 5th-generation fighters now. Tolini smiled, the knowing smile of a man who'd killed 3 Iraqi fighters before their pilots knew he existed. Because it still works, he said simply. Technology changes. Missiles get smarter. Radar gets better. But the fundamentals, thrust, wing area, weapons capacity, range, those don't change. The F-15 had those fundamentals right in 1972. They're still right today. The F-15EX was the latest iteration, fly-by-wire controls, and /APG 82 AESA radar, electronic warfare suites, weapons capacity expanded to hold over 29,000 pounds of ordnance. It could carry more weapons, fly farther, fight longer than any fighter in American inventory. And at its core was the same basic design Soviet engineers had dismissed as draggy, inefficient, wasteful. At Ramstein Air Base, Germany, Captain Jennifer Viper Chen walked around her F-15C, doing the pre-flight inspection her predecessors had done for 50 years. The aircraft beside hers had been built in 1982, 41 years old, older than she was. But it had been upgraded, refurbished, rebuilt. New engines. New radar. New avionics. The airframe still had thousands of hours of life remaining. Above her, contrails marked where a flight of F-15s orbited, maintaining the aerial sovereignty they'd held since her father's time, since her grandfather's time. 3 generations of pilots. 1 aircraft. In Russia, the successors to Soviet aviation industry had finally produced fighters that could challenge the F-15, the Su-35S, Su-57. Advanced aircraft with thrust vectoring, modern electronics, stealth characteristics. But they were decades late. And meanwhile, the Americans had moved on to F-22s and F-35s, keeping the F-15 as what it had become, the most reliable, most survivable, most lethal air superiority platform ever built. No Soviet engineer had predicted this in 1972. They'd predicted the F-15 would be too complex, too expensive, too specialized. They'd been right about the cost. Every F-15 was expensive. They'd been right about the complexity. Maintaining an F-15 required sophisticated support infrastructure. But they'd been catastrophically wrong about what it could do. Belyakov had written a memoir in 2010, published only in Russian, titled The Americans We Underestimated. Few outside Russia read it. But one passage stood out. We assumed American engineering followed our pattern: grand promises, mediocre execution, peacetime theories that failed in wartime reality. We forgot that American aviation had produced the B-17, the Mustang, the F-86 Sabre. We forgot that when Americans engineer something, they engineer it to work. Not to impress committees. Not to look good in parades. To work. The F-15 worked. It has worked for 50 years. It will likely work for 50 more. At Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, F-15s scrambled daily to intercept Chinese aircraft probing Japanese airspace. The Eagles were older than the pilots flying them, but still faster, still deadlier than the J-20s and Su-35s they faced across the air defense identification zone. Chinese military observers filed reports noting the same thing Soviet observers had noted 40 years earlier. The F-15s were still there, still flying, still capable, still unbeaten. The production line at Boeing's St. Louis facility, where the first F-15 had been built in 1972, remained open in 2024. Orders from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel kept the assembly floor humming. Each new Eagle incorporated lessons from 50 years of combat, 50 years of technological advancement. But the basic aircraft, the twin engines, the high thrust-to-weight ratio, the massive internal fuel capacity, the weapon stations, the turning radius, remained fundamentally unchanged. Because you don't change what works. On November 14, 2023, the U.S. Air Force announced it would keep F-15s in service until at least 2050. 78 years after the first prototype flew. There were pilots who would fly the F-15 whose great-grandfathers had flown the F-15. Think about that. A fighter aircraft spanning 4 generations of pilots. Undefeated in combat across that entire span. In his Moscow apartment, General Volkov, 96 years old now, living on a Soviet military pension that barely covered his expenses, kept a single photograph on his wall. It showed an F-15C in Israeli markings, photographed during Desert Storm, 6 kill markers painted beneath the canopy. He'd taken it from an intelligence briefing 40 years ago. "Why do you keep that?" his daughter asked him once. "To remember," he said quietly. "To remember what happens when you're certain you're right." The laughter from that briefing room in 1972 still echoed in his memory. The confidence. The dismissiveness. The absolute certainty that Soviet engineering had no equal. And then the years that followed. Lebanon. Desert Storm. Kosovo. Iraq again. Syria. Every conflict featuring Soviet-built aircraft ended the same way. Eagles hunting them from the sky, kill ratios so lopsided they looked like propaganda but were simply reality. The F-15 hadn't just dominated for a few years. It had dominated for generations. When Soviet engineers had dismissed it, they'd assumed it would be replaced in a decade, as most fighters were. They'd never imagined it would still be patrolling the skies their grandchildren flew under, still undefeated, still lethal, still hunting. That was the real lesson. Not just that they'd been wrong about the F-15, but that they'd fundamentally misunderstood how Americans approached engineering. The Soviets built for ideology, for national pride, for showing the world their superiority. Americans built for war. For pilots who'd stake their lives on whether the aircraft worked as designed. For missions that couldn't fail because real consequences hung in the balance. The F-15 worked because it had to work. And because it worked, it endured. Captain McKinley, The pilot who'd climbed into that F-15A at Ramstein in 1977 was now 83 years old, retired in Arizona. Sometimes he'd see contrails overhead, eagles from Luke Air Force Base running training missions, and he'd remember what it felt like. The cathedral canopy. The massive thrust. The absolute confidence that whatever else happened, his aircraft would get him home. 50 years later, pilots were still feeling that same confidence. Still flying that same basic aircraft. Still coming home. The laughter had stopped decades ago. What remained was respect. Grudging, bitter respect from those who'd dismissed it. Fierce, proud respect from those who'd flown it. And simple, empirical respect from anyone who studied the numbers. 104 kills. 0 losses. 52 years and counting. The eagles still fly. And nobody laughs anymore.